The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The first week of November is Holocaust Education Week. And so tonight we explore the ways educators are keeping that history alive. Then J.N. Jagannathan speaks to war historian Tim Cook about how Canada and the U.S. joined forces to defeat fascism in World War II. That's all next on The Agenda. In a time where Jews are the most represented group in reported hate crimes in Canada, learning about the history of the Holocaust is essential. How do we ensure that people have an accurate understanding of this dark period of history, and what will educators do differently when there are no survivors left to tell their stories firsthand? For more, we are joined by Dara Solomon. She is Executive Director of the Toronto Holocaust Museum. Michelle Gleed-Goldstein, founder of Carrying Holocaust Testimony. Shelley Laskin, Toronto District School Board Trustee for Ward 8, that's Eglinton Lawrence and Toronto St. Paul's. And Marilyn Sinclair, founder of Liberation 75. And I want to thank all four of you for joining us here at TVO tonight for an important and timely discussion. And Shelley, I want to start with you because we want to start with our school system. Last year, the Ontario government announced that they wanted to expand mandatory learning about the Holocaust for grade 10 history. That will come into effect next year. Give us some of the background. How did that come to be?
Well, back in 2020, we did a motion at the Toronto District School Board for the importance of genocide education. It really is important in our diverse system to speak about the inclusion and have kids learn history, so we frankly learn how to combat hatred in all its forms in our schools. And it started with the grade 6. We were really pleased about that, and we're looking forward to grade 10 as well.
How'd you convince the Minister of Education to do it?
Well, it wasn't my personal convincing of the Minister of Education. If that was the case, I would have had a long list of what I would have asked of the Minister.
Okay.
But I really think it was a combination of just what was happening in the States at the time. It was a Trump election, and it was a combination of what was happening here, too, as issues of anti-Semitism continued to rise.
Dara, grade 6, learning about genocide. How much detail can you get into?
So we introduced the Holocaust in age-appropriate ways, and really in grade 6 we're introducing who Jews are as Canadians, and how did Canada respond to the Holocaust during that time, and how did the survivors who ended up building their lives in Canada contribute to Canadian society. So we really don't go into the detail of the genocide. It's really who Jews are, anti-Semitism in Canada during that time in the 1930s, but we don't go into great detail about concentration camps. It's more about separation from family and introducing it in ways that make sense for a 10, 11-year-old.
Which raises the question for Marilyn, how young is too young to start learning about this?
We like grade 6, although there are many organizations that will teach about the Holocaust in younger grades, particularly in the United States and a couple of the states. But they do it in very sensitive ways. Like Dara said, talking about separation of parents and children, sometimes talking about the separation of a child and their dog. So, for instance, the USC Shoah Foundation has a great program called Lala that they start in grade 2, and it really hinges on that experience of a boy with his dog. But we think that grade 6 is a really good place to start Holocaust education.
Your group's called Liberation 75. What do you guys do?
We teach about the Holocaust. Our priority is really supporting the grade 6 curriculum this year, educating the teachers about how to teach about this challenging subject. We really want the teachers to teach about it. There is no curriculum police, so even though they're supposed to teach about it, they don't have to, technically. So what we have done is we've launched a book program. We actually use Kathy Kaser's book, To Hope and Back, which is the story of the St. Louis, which is very good for grade 6 audience, and it talks about who Jews are, the immigration policy in Canada during World War II.
You need to take another 30 seconds and just tell everybody who doesn't know about the story of the St. Louis, which was a ship with a tragic story.
Yes. In 1938, about 900 Jews, were on a ship from Europe to come to had a safe passage to Cuba, where they had entry visas. Cuba decided not to honor the entry visas, and the captain of the ship, who was later honored as a righteous among nations, tried to find a port that would take the ship, including Canada. And Canada at that time's immigration policy, when it came to Jews, was none is too many. They sent the ship back. 1/3 of the passengers of the ship ended up dying in camps and in various situations in Europe. And Canada since apologized for not allowing the Jewish refugees into Canada. So this is a wonderful story about the Jews who were on the ship through the eyes of the children, so that the children in our school system can relate to them, and through the eyes of the captain, who worked very, very hard to save this boatload of Jews against the Nazi regime.
Michelle, tell me about carrying Holocaust testimony. What's your mission?
Our organization it empowers descendants of Holocaust survivors to share their family history in schools. We film an interview between the survivor and the descendant, and they use that interview in combination with their own personal history of growing up in the shadows of the Holocaust and photographs and artifacts that they have to go into schools, share the survivor testimony. And it's really a program designed to fill in for survivor testimony in a world where we no longer have survivors. And we feel it's very important to enhance Holocaust education with that survivor testimony, to really allow students to get a meaningful understanding of what happened, to make sense of the numbers of the Holocaust, and to really understand the importance of learning that history.
We have an example of some of your work. Shall we take a look at this, Sheldon? If you would, let's roll the clip here.
When you finally arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau and they opened the doors, what did you see? What was it like? What was going on?
Train stopped and waited for a while, and then all of a sudden the doors were swung open. I looked out, and there was barbed wire on the other side. This was a graveled sort of a yard in front, and there were some other railroad tracks further away. And then all of a sudden I saw this large group of what I looked at that time as having pajamas on, blue and gray striped pajamas with little round hats, who started swarming in and started to scream at the top of their voices to have everybody out of the boxcars. It was chaos.
That's you and your dad, Bill.
Yes.
We all at this table know that there are many Holocaust survivors who do not want to talk about those experiences. How did you convince him to go on camera and discuss?
Well, my father didn't talk about it for many, many years until one of my sisters asked him why we don't have grandparents. And at that point, he felt the need to start talking about it. And he did take us back to Europe shortly after that, to the places where these events occurred, shared his history with us. And then he became quite a prolific speaker in our community. And I think he found some satisfaction in it. I think for some people, it's very hard to dig up that history. And certainly every time he shared it, it was very difficult for him. But at the same time, he felt he was memorializing his parents and his sibling who he had lost, and that he was trying to make the world a better place in the future by educating students about the Holocaust. So I think he found it difficult but satisfying. And so he was happy to do this project, and he was very concerned about what was going to happen when the survivors couldn't speak anymore. So really it came out of his initiative to do something for the future.
Shelley, back to you on the education system. We want our teachers nowadays to be experts in everything. They got to know how to teach all the basic core subjects, et cetera, and, financial literacy and home economics and the whole 9 yards. How this is very heavy subject matter. How do you know that teachers are adequately prepared to teach this kind of subject matter?
Well, thank goodness we have these organizations that exist to help prepare, but in actual fact, I would say that it's very difficult to add teachers to be subject matter experts when there is no mandated professional learning provided. And one of the voids, I think, still with the ministry, it's great to have the curriculum, but I also think There should be mandated professional learning and release time, because teachers do so much on their own time that if the government is serious about educating our kids against all forms of hate, then it really should be part of a professional activity day curriculum or another kind of release time for mandatory education.
I have a hunch Dara not only agrees with that, but can think of a place that teachers and students should go to learn all about this. You want to tell us about what you're doing?
Yeah, so actually last week we had 130 grade 6 teachers from across the province come to the Toronto Holocaust Museum for a full day of learning with the museum team and partners, the Azrieli Memoirs Program and Facing History and Ourselves. And these teachers came as far away as Thunder Bay and Moosonee, and release time was given and covered, which made, the incentive was there to come. And they not only learned about the Holocaust, a deep dive into the Holocaust, but really learned about who Jews are as people and as Canadians, which is essential to this learning at grade 6. And we also did a piece on contemporary anti-Semitism, so they understand what the Jewish community is going through today and making those connections between the Holocaust and our current moment. And it was fantastic, and we offer a number of ongoing workshops for students and for people further afield outside of the GTA. We do a lot of online training. We just created a brand new virtual experience of the museum for students that wouldn't be able to come because it's too far away, specifically built around this new grade 6 curriculum. And we're there to support the teachers and make sure they feel confident in teaching this challenging history.
Well, we do like empirically provable facts on this program, and I'm going to introduce some here, and they are, what should we say? These facts suggest that you all have a lot of work still to do. Here's some polling. Leger, the polling firm from Quebec, did some polling for the Association of Canadian Studies earlier this year, and the question was, who agrees with the idea that the Holocaust was exaggerated? 16% of Canadians surveyed from the ages 18 to 24 agree with the statement that the Holocaust was exaggerated. Only 2% of Canadians 65 and older, suggesting that the further you get away from this event, the more trouble we've got. And in case you thought things were better here than in the United States, no. 15% of Americans aged 18 to 29 agree with that statement that the Holocaust was exaggerated, practically the same number as us. And additionally, 27% of Canadians 18 to 24 say fewer than 6 million Jews were killed. And the number 6 million Jews is one of the most documented genocides in the history of the world. So the fact that more than a quarter of the people surveyed between ages 18 and 24 don't believe that many were killed is, Marilyn, disquieting. What explains this ignorance?
It's a really good question, Steve. I think, first of all, we have to ask, where are people learning about the Holocaust? So when we did our study in 2021, we found that 42% of students said that they learned about the Holocaust from social media. So we know that's a very bad place for people to learn about the Holocaust. So that contributes to that. We also have a lot of new immigrant populations who come from countries where they don't learn about the Holocaust in their school systems. So we have that to contend with. We have the fact that it was only implemented into the curriculum in grade 6 this past September. So we're dealing with a very small cohort of people who have officially learned about the Holocaust. So where are people learning about it? They learn about it from teachers who have embraced the stories of the Holocaust because of their own interest in it, or social media, or movies. And some of the movies that are out there, like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, are very bad movies. And they've been widely watched and widely taught from in classrooms.
You've got me interested here because I saw that movie, coincidentally, just last week, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. What don't you like about it?
Well, it's not just me. I'm quoting the experts in the field who don't like it. I personally don't like it, too. At the end of the movie, who do you cry for? You cry for the German child who dies. So the whole thing is the narrative from the perspective of the perpetrator, not the victim, is one. And two, it's grossly false, as if people had autonomy within the camps to go and play in the yard and meet their friends at a fence. It's just a bad movie all around.
Okay. Michelle, follow up, if you would, on why there seems to be so much apparent disbelief among younger people in particular? What's going on?
Well, I think that they're seeing a lot of anti-Semitism on social media. They're seeing a lot of it on gaming sites and other places where they're socializing, and they're not hearing the other side of the story. They're only learning the anti-Semitism. That's what's in their face. And we haven't had the opportunity enough to get in to formally educate them.
I know there is a belief that education can solve all of our problems, but I don't know if education can compete with social media. What do you think?
It's a good question. I think we have a lot of work to do. I think the government has a lot of work to do in terms of curbing social media and all the misinformation and disinformation that's on there, because I agree with you. The amount of time the kids spend on there is really dangerous, and education alone can't counter it. We need parent education as well, and we need the government to step in and put some kinds of controls in place to stop all the hatred that's on social media.
Shelley, I don't frankly know what the population of the Greater Toronto Area is. I guess it's probably about 5 or 6 million. There's 300,000 Jews in Toronto. In Canada. 300,000 in Canada.
Right, 0.2%.
Yeah, I mean, it's a statistically insignificant number. 15 million Jews in a world of 8 billion people.
Right.
There are a lot of people who don't know any Jews. Does that make it difficult to change the narrative here?
I do, but I think education goes beyond content. So it's beyond content of the Holocaust. It's really a lot about media literacy and critical thinking. And those are the skills that really need to be taught so that when kids hear information, they can actually think for themselves and have critical understanding. So content on the Holocaust is one thing, but educating kids to be critical thinkers and questioning and understanding and then delving more, and then which resources are the resources to look up. And that's really part of the challenge when there is so much information out there, discerning which is the information. And that's why these organizations exist, frankly, because we know they're credible sources of information for public education system.
Okay, Marilyn, you ready for a very tricky question here?
Sure.
Do you see people invoking the Holocaust to make a point, and at times it's inappropriate for them to do so?
Absolutely. And it's getting worse. It's not getting better. And when you listen to people, even just out on the streets, it seems everything is a Holocaust right now. Everything is a genocide. Everything, people are oppressed. My children once said they were oppressed because they had to put their clothes in the laundry chute. It absolutely is true, and it's very difficult, I think, for all of us who are in this space to make sure that people, first of all, like Dara and Shelley say, know who are Jews and the experience of the Jews, to understand anti-Semitism, to understand what a genocide is, and to understand what the Holocaust was, that it was a singular event in history, the greatest genocide in history, the first industrialized murder in the world. The kids need to understand that, because language can become very, very loose and very dangerous.
I want to pick up on that with you. We often hear people use the word Holocaust to mean a terrible event.
Right.
You heard about, when I was a kid during the Cold War, they talked about a nuclear Holocaust, that kind of thing. But Marilyn just used the expression, the Holocaust, as in it is one thing only, and that word should not be used for anything else. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think that's where you start getting Holocaust misinformation, when you start using analogies with the Holocaust. We need to make sure that the students understand that the Holocaust was the systematic killing of the Jews of Europe. 1 in 3 Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. These facts really matter. And if we don't sort of protect the facts and get them out there, then people start using the language in a sloppy way that's frankly dangerous.
Well, let's follow up on that. Michelle, if a young person came to you today and said, I've heard something about this thing during World War II called the Holocaust, but I don't really know anything about it. if you had a minute to tell them, I hate to use this expression, but an elevator pitch about what you need to know in a minute about the Holocaust, what would you tell them?
I would tell them that the Holocaust, as Dara just said, was the systematic killing of the Jews and other targeted groups between 1939 and 1945, but also that the Holocaust didn't happen by accident, that it was an event that happened because people and groups and governments made choices or ignored choices that needed to be made and allowed this to happen, and that it is important for them to learn this history to make sure that those kinds of things don't happen again, that we hold ourselves, our organizations, and our governments accountable to fight against prejudice, discrimination, racism.
Now, it's interesting. You didn't say anything there about gas chambers or Cyclone B or concentration camps, or those are details you would not put into an initial response?
Look, those are facts of the Holocaust that people need to know and understand. But when we talk about the lessons of the Holocaust, the reason to learn it is not specifically to know that there was a gas chamber. I mean, they need to know this history. It's not that they shouldn't, but what they need to take away is what they can use for the future. And I think what they need to take away is that they have a personal responsibility, that this happened because people need to think about the environment they're in, the decisions they're making, the news they're getting. And I think that's what they need to take out of it.
Marilyn, she also said it wasn't just Jews. Who else perished in the Holocaust that we need to know about?
The homosexuals, the Roma Sinti, the political prisoners, the intelligentsia. There were many other victims, but none of them were targeted like the Jews. The Jews were targeted for total extermination, and they were the only group that were targeted in that way.
There is a lot of information you can find out online, Dara, about the Holocaust, and I suspect a ton of it is not accurate. At the risk of as we try to educate people, what are things that people hear about that simply are not true?
I think that everything is like a soundbite these days, and it just took three questions to find out like the definition of the Holocaust, but everybody's looking for these quick soundbites. So I think those short memes that go viral that sort of make light of the Holocaust or maybe deny some of the facts of the Holocaust, people are attracted to those because they're short, and history is actually complicated and you need to spend time on it. So I think that's some of the danger, is just the flippant way that the Holocaust is mentioned in the current culture, especially on social media.
Shelley, can I follow up with you on that, in as much as, yes, we now have mandated Holocaust education because the Ministry of Education made a decision that there ought to be. But knowing how many opinions there are in the Toronto school system, I can imagine that not everybody is thrilled. Maybe some teachers aren't thrilled about having to learn it. Maybe some parents aren't thrilled that their kids are going to have to learn it. What do you do about that?
I think you persevere. I think that there are some facts of history that are worth learning about as they apply to other situations that exist. When we made the first motion, we asked about a genocide curriculum that included the Holocaust, because there are other genocides that should be acknowledged. Canada has acknowledged many other genocides, another one's coming up later this month in November, the Holodomor, the Armenian genocide. These are important events in our public school system where we have diversity of cultures from around the world, to feel that their stories are acknowledged and the learnings from those stories in terms of making somebody feel that they're the other, othering someone simply because they may not look like you or pray like you or act like you. Those are the universal learnings of teaching of tolerance and inclusion, and that's why it's critically important if you believe in inclusion and if you believe in diversity, where we are different, our similarities in terms of being human, kindness, empathy, listening to others, acknowledging those differences, can really counter the amount of hate and the lack of tolerance. And really, that's really a critical piece of education.
Quick follow-up here. Do you sense much resistance from within the school system to having to teach this?
I never had until after October 7th. That's an honest answer. This was, this is beginnings of Holocaust Education Week, and many of our high schools are privileged to invite survivors in and speak at assemblies. And this, I've been a trustee for many, many, many years. We have done Holocaust education for many, many, many years. This is the first time I ever got pushback on one of those assemblies.
Okay. We could do a whole other show on this, but I'm going to make sure we don't today because I want to keep our eye on the prize here. And so we're going to do that right now. Marilyn, what's going to happen? There are still survivors of the Holocaust among us.
Yes.
But there won't be for long. Mm-hmm. What happens then?
So many organizations, including all of the ones at this table, are building resources based on testimony, which we know is one of the most powerful ways to teach about the Holocaust. We can't replace the survivors. We can try to make the best of it, and we will. And by the way, as Shelley just said, there are still survivors who are willing to come and speak and who are excellent speakers, but their numbers are tragically dwindling. And we are going to, I know Liberation 75, work with organizations from around the world and around the country and our city to be able to provide testimonies in different ways. So for instance, Dimensions in Testimony, which is a hologram-like way of teaching. What Michelle is doing is she is using testimonies without having to have the actual survivors. There are so many innovative ways, and the experience at the Toronto Holocaust Museum, where you can hear all kinds of survivors through their testimonies, is very, very powerful. And books that talk about experiences of people who have survived the Holocaust, or in some cases didn't survive the Holocaust. Those are the tools that we're all going to be using.
I remember when you guys had your opening day, and Premier Ford was there with a number of his cabinet ministers. There were many federal and municipal politicians there as well. And I remember the look on the Premier's face when he saw some of the holographic testimony that is at your museum. And he was, it connected.
Yeah.
Maybe for those who haven't been, just describe some of what that's about.
Sure. So we built the museum for the next generation, knowing that the survivors weren't going to be with us for much longer. And we know that at the core of strong Holocaust education is testimony and the access to hearing these first-person narratives. So throughout the museum, there are 11 interactive testimony kiosks on touch screens. All the testimony has been curated into short clips, and they're a theme-based and around questions, because of inquiry-based learning is how students learn best. So you go to a kiosk, so if you're in the pre-war section, it's like, what was Jewish ritual like in your home before the war? And you can click on, one of several testimonies of survivors talking about what celebrating Passover was like in 1920s, 1930s in the small little Polish town that they lived in. And then when you get to the area in the Holocaust, when we're talking about ghettoization and the concentration camps, you hear testimony about, like we just heard from Bill, the arrival on the platform when the train arrived, or Max Eisen reflecting on what it was like to get the tattoo on his arm. And these stories are so compelling, and we actually have seen students lying on the floor in front of the testimony station, which is great because it shows how engaged and comfortable they are, and they're taking turns, listening to different clips. And we hope that range of experiences, learning about the Holocaust and these different unique narratives really impact them, because they feel like they've met a survivor, even though they're sadly not with us anymore.
Max Eisen was a guest on this program a few years ago, and he's since passed on, but his book might be the best thing I've ever read on the Holocaust. It was absolutely incredible.
Yes.
Max Eisen, Google him and get his book.
Absolutely.
Sorry, what was it called?
By
Chance Alone.
By Chance Alone. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, very good. Follow up if you would. You're putting an archive together. What are your hopes for that archive as the survivors more and more start to die off?
Our hope is that they'll get shown in schools, that we'll be able to reach as many students as possible with a personal narrative. that those personal narratives will be shared by a descendant who has that personal impact, that the students are often meeting a Jewish person, sharing their parent's story, that they have that experience, and that will help students make meaning and remember what happened.
Dara, I've got time for one more question, and again, it's a bit of a hard one. If anybody watching this or listening to this right now encounters somebody who says, you know, I think the Holocaust was all exaggerated and I don't believe it ever happened, what do you do?
I would invite them to the Toronto Holocaust Museum and take them on a tour through the galleries. And I think I would bring one of our remaining survivors with us so that we could, you know, introduce them to a living part of this history and hear firsthand what happened to them and how their families were murdered and the rise of Nazism. I think they need a history lesson. Gotcha.
I want to thank the four of you for coming into TVO tonight and helping us out with this. Mr. Director, if you would, let's say thank you to Michelle Gleed Goldstein, founder of Carrying Holocaust Testimony, and Marilyn Sinclair, the founder of Liberation 75. And on the other side of the table, Shelley Laskin, TDSB, Toronto District School Board Trustee for Ward 8, and Dara Solomon, Executive Director of the Toronto Holocaust Museum, which is where?
The museum is located at 4588 Bathurst Street in North York, just Bathurst and Shepherd.
Gotcha. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
At the time the Second World War began, the relationship between Canada and the United States was still fairly divided and characterized by mutual suspicion and rivalry. But over the course of the war, Canada's Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King and the U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt learned to negotiate and strategize to help Britain and the Allies win. Military historian Tim Cook takes readers through key moments for Canadians at war and at home in his book, The Good Allies, How Canada and the United States fought together to defeat fascism during the Second World War. He's also chief historian and director of research at the Canadian War Museum, and Tim Cook joins us in studio for more. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
All right. With many previous Canadian military books under your belt, I think we're nearing 20 at this point?
That's right, yeah.
All right. Why write about the Canadian-American relationship now?
Yeah, why write about it? Well, I guess I wanted to explore something different. And as you said, it's 19 books, so there's a lot there. And I've had people ask me, is there anything left to say about the Second World War, World War II? But one of the things that really interested me was the relationship between Canada and the United States. And that hadn't really been explored in great detail. So I thought now, I started this about 2 years ago. I had a sense if I could get it out before the election, it might be a time for Canadians to better understand the relationship with the United States, but maybe also with our American friends to have a sense of what Canada did and how we stood by our allies during the Second World War, this crucial war against fascism, against the Nazis, this desperate period where 1.1 million Canadians served in uniform from a country of 11 million, so about 1 in 10. And often, I had been down in the U.S. and occasionally I would talk about my books or something. And Americans, very good-heartedly, but I think honestly said, had no idea. Didn't even know Canada was in the war. So that had happened enough times where I thought, okay, maybe it's not up to the Americans to tell this story. Maybe it's up to we Canadians.
As I mentioned earlier, I'm a product of the public school system here in Ontario. Not just the Americans, maybe it doesn't surprise us that Americans don't know this story, but are you surprised that Canadians may not know a lot about this story?
I suppose I'm not surprised. I think most Canadians would understand we served in the Second World War. We stood by Britain after the disaster and the catastrophe of when France fell to Hitler's forces. But we're moving on many generations now, and I'm very lucky to work at the Canadian War Museum. And we've had discussions there about young people and that we're going to have to work harder to talk about Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler and the rise of fascism, because that that's a long time ago. We've had a lot of history between now and then. So don't blame yourself, and I don't blame others. But I do think this is an important story to tell, partially because I think we're in a bit of a dark time now with our own history, with the world around us, with major wars happening, in Gaza, in other places, in Ukraine, great instability, tremendous conflict. Canada's armed forces gearing up and in multiple places. It's good, I think, to reflect back on where we have come from. And this is a period, 1939 to 1945, where Canada really punched above its weight.
Right.
And maybe we'll have a chance to talk about some of those contributions. But it really is quite staggering. And I think most Canadians probably don't know that full history.
All right, well, let's go back in time. Let's go 1939, set the stage. What was Canada and the U.S. relationship like at that time?
Not great, not great. And we were a small country next to the United States. The United States had already surpassed Britain as an economic power. It wasn't a military power. And yet Canada, emerging from the Depression, poor, really quite pathetic, in fact, and rightly we had let our military wither away, even with the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and Japan invading China in 1937, or even before that, in 1931, if you think about the war and conflict there. The world is a roiling, unstable, dangerous place. But North America is secure, even though Canada and the United States really don't have much of a security or defense pact or alliance of that. And I thought, isn't that amazing? And as part of my research, I found these invasion plans. In the 1920s, both countries had invasion plans. Canada was supposed to cross over the border, seize a number of key cities, wait for the Royal Navy to sail across. Even Australia was supposed to send an expeditionary force to invade California and then retreat back. And the Americans had a more developed plan. They were going to capture Victoria, Winnipeg, right? Douse Halifax in chemical weapons and march on Ottawa. Now, that was unrealistic, but it gives you a sense of some of the tension here. But as you mentioned from the top, Mackenzie King, our prime minister, our longest serving prime minister, when he comes back to power in 1935, he understands he needs to work hard with the Americans. And so he begins to set up great trade deals, economy, and how we will protect North America in case of war. And as we know, war will come in September of 1939, or at least it'll come for Canada.
Well, let's talk about that. In your book, you mentioned, for Canada to stand with Britain, it has to lean into that relationship with the U.S. How did King balance that? And I know that you had access to this diary that had kind of delved into the character of King and got to understand, how he made some of these decisions. He didn't have a lot of people to talk to or bounce those ideas back. But how did he balance that relationship?
Yeah, great question. William Lyon Mackenzie King, our longest serving prime minister, was our prime minister before the war, coming back to power in 1935, and then through the war. If we go back to education, you were probably taught, as I was taught, Mackenzie King, this strange, sad old man who never married, had no kids, deeply lonely, who was a spiritualist, engaged in seances, table rapping. He took advice from the dead, prime ministers, his mother, even his dog. And he's been a bit of a joke in history. And yet, of course, he's our longest serving prime minister. You don't become that by being a joke, right? So he was a shrewd political operator as well. And I think we really have to give a lot of credit to Mackenzie King for forging this alliance with President Roosevelt, which helps Canada achieve its strategic aims during the war. Now, we should remember when Nazi Germany invades Poland, and that starts the Second War in Europe, which brings in Britain and France. The decision is Canada. What will we do? Right? We control our foreign policy. There's a debate in the House of Commons, and we decide to go to war at Britain's side on the 10th of September. But everybody is looking to the South. What will the Americans do? And of course, they are neutral. And Roosevelt understood that Americans did not want to fight in this war. They didn't have the same connections to Britain as we did. And yet that's devastating, right? I mean, think about now if one country was at war in North America and the other was not. And the great doomsday scenario for the United States is that Nazi Germany will invade Canada and be on the border of the U.S. So really, the Americans, it's a long story, I recount it in the book, but they begin to support us in Canada. They support us through our wartime industry, which becomes an astonishing output. They support us other ways as well. They do so, I think, we shouldn't mistake this. I mean, it's not out of full altruism, right? They want to secure Canada.
Right.
But Mackenzie King, he understood that. And I think it helped him achieve the war aim, which is the war aim of Canada, which is support Britain, which is on the front lines.
Right.
But we can't do that without a secure North America. And largely historians, I think, up to this point, haven't paid much attention to that. Much more comfortable writing about Dieppe or the Battle of Hong Kong or the Battle of the Atlantic, and I've done that. I'm guilty of that in books. And yet you need a secure North America before you can send armies and navies and air forces abroad.
Can you help shed a little light on the reluctancy of the U.S. to enter the war? It was, a couple of years until.
Yeah.
But what was it initially that, had them sitting back, which is unusual to think of now?
It is, yeah. It's a great question, right? We know when the Americans come in. It's December 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which brings Canada into war with Japan as well, because we have forces that are attacked in Hong Kong. And in a little interesting aside, we declare war on Japan before the United States.
Yeah.
But to your question is a great one. Why aren't the Americans there? Well, of course, our greatest shield is our geography. It's the Atlantic in protecting against the war with Germany. And Americans simply did not want to go to war again. They had fought in World War I, coming in late to that in April of 1917. Canada had been there from the start, of course, of August of 1914. We had paid a terrible price in that war, 66,000 Canadians killed, and yet we know the Great War propels Canada forward, a new sense of identity, national sense of who we are. But the Americans, they don't have the same ties. And so one of the key things, I was going through the Roosevelt papers, his archives, fascinating to see. At the start of the war, only 2.5% of Americans, not 25%, 2.5% think they should come into the war. And so it takes time to build that consensus and momentum. And Roosevelt understands he has to stand by the Western Allies. But after the fall of France in June of 1940, the retreat of the British Army from Dunkirk, that is a catastrophe. And of course, that's when Canada really rises to become the ranking power to Britain. Our wartime industry churning out weapons of war, and yet we couldn't have done it without the Americans.
I want to talk about some of the deals and policies, primarily around security and finance, that got hammered out. Tell me a little bit about some of those important deals that happened.
Yeah, that's part of, I guess, Mackenzie King's genius, right? He, there's all kinds of machinations and the White House initially, when Britain is, driven off the continent, and its army is saved, as we know, from Dunkirk, but it leaves behind all of its tanks and artillery and trucks and weapons. Then it's Canada that has to rise up to supply our allies. And we do that. It's just astonishing, our wartime industry. A lot of it fueled by American support. The auto sector, converts to making tanks, and we produce 16,000 aircraft and 850,000 trucks, which is quite remarkable. But to do all of this, we need the financial support of the United States and that security element. And so this is Mackenzie King and Roosevelt engaging in, I guess, what we'd call summit diplomacy, where the two of them are talking. And Roosevelt, interestingly, and I was surprised to find this, he's in his White House, he has all kinds of advisors who don't want to help Canada. They want to squeeze Canada financially, as they are doing to Britain, even with things like Lend-Lease, which begins in early 1941. But I think it's Mackenzie King's quiet genius. He was not a charismatic person, as you had mentioned before. He's kind of a sad character, and a chance to read his diary, which is 30,000 pages long. He kept it his whole life, and I've read it all through the war years, and it's filled with fascinating insight. I mean, just as an aside, imagine if Trudeau or Harper kept a diary that we could read today. Maybe they have. Maybe the historians of the future will have access to that. I suspect not. But Mackenzie King's diaries are available. I read through them. They show both a political operator who understands he has to work with the Americans. Sometimes he has to ingratiate himself. It's a little painful for a Canadian nationalist. At other times, he's agonizing over all kinds of minor things, and yet he gets the job done. And so as you alluded to there, the financial part, the Americans agree, in short, to buy our war supplies, even as we are buying their war supplies. We send our raw minerals south. Maybe one of our greatest contributions is aluminum. You don't see that in the history books, but we pull out something like 3 billion pounds of it, and we send it south, as we do nickel as well, all of which is essential in the war weapons. And this is where, you know, in addition to 850,000 trucks and hundreds of thousands of machine guns, I began to think of Canada differently. I mean, we think usually of the 1.1 million Canadians in the fighting forces, but you know, with the United States, there's this incredible trade that goes on. And, you know, we're forever changed by that. We become a much more industrialized nation. We become entwined with the United States as well, or entangled, as some might say. But that's part of the Defense Pact in 1940 and the Financial Pact in 1941. And frankly, you know, the Americans need us to come back to that point of security. They need us to help them defend the East Coast and the West Coast and the North. And that's maybe a lesson among many in this book, that we often think we're much smaller, we're less wealthy, we don't have the same military power as the United States, but we are defending North America together.
All right, I want to read a little snippet from your book, and it reads, and this is in regards to King, Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill being three distinct leaders. Ever the conciliator and compromiser, King was careful with every step he took, while Churchill burst forward demanding action this day, and Roosevelt maneuvered relentlessly as the cheerful master manipulator of the Washington Carnival, with spotlight on him for full effect. King could never match the spirit and verve of these two titans. But as a leader with little flash, King was always tougher than his few friends and many foes gave him credit for. You know, after playing such a key role in this alliance, King may have found himself kind of left out in a lot of the strategizing. How did that happen?
Yeah, and thanks for reading that. You read it nicely, and I remember writing that over and over again and trying to think about it, because there's an interesting stat I have in the book, or story at least, where Canadians, when they talked about their war leaders, they meant Churchill and Roosevelt. And that was really painful to Mackenzie King, because he was, of course, our war leader. But he didn't have the same charisma. And these two titans, right? We know Churchill and Roosevelt still to this day. Films are made about them. There must be, you know, a history book coming out every 3 weeks. And Canada pushed aside. And Mackenzie King, I think he understood that while we were an important ally, we didn't rank with Britain or the United States. And I don't make that argument or case either. We need to understand our role. It was a significant one in all kinds of areas. But when Britain and the United States really begin to forge their military alliance in early 1942, so this is after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and Hitler insanely declares war in the United States. So the United States is in a two-front war, and really that relationship with Britain is crucial. King does get elbowed out of the room, and he's always attempting to find a way back in, and I recount that. And we were very lucky to have phenomenal diplomats and incredible soldiers. And one of the things we do is we send some of our best to London, but we send our best also to Washington. Lieutenant General Maurice Pope, a bilingual decorated soldier from the First War. He is there as our military attaché. A number of very good diplomats, including Lester B. Pearson, right? Future Prime Minister in Canada. So just like today, I mean, we sent our best to Washington because we had to figure out a way to negotiate and engage in that delicate dance. And one of the ways we could have a presence with the Americans was in the defense of North America and that wartime industry. So we weren't able to really engage in setting wartime strategy. But we were there with the Americans because they understood they needed Canada. And frankly, when the Americans are drawn into the war in late 41, early 42, the German U-boats are already on the East Coast, and they savage the American merchant ships, which aren't sailing in convoys. They're deeply unprepared. They have an incompetent commander, in my mind. And they're being sunk in horrific numbers on the East Coast. And it takes the Royal Canadian Navy to sail south to help the Americans on the West Coast when the Americans are in a frenzy over Pearl Harbor and fearful of a Japanese invasion. It's Canada that stands up. That we send a division there. We send some of our best naval assets, even though the Battle of the Atlantic is going very badly. We send 4 squadrons to Alaska. We stand up, and Mackenzie King realizes we have to do this. We even allow the Americans to build the Alaska Highway, which is really scary for Canada, because on a map it looks like it's going to split Canada in two and it connects to Alaska. Another wartime legacy. And as I recount in the book, there's this continual challenge of how we will lean into the Americans so that we can help the British but not lose our sovereignty. And that's not easy. And of course, it's probably the same thing that every prime minister, you've covered so many of these stories, and cabinets have had to do. And of course, it continues to this day. The United States is our most important trading partner, most important security partner. We are talking about NATO. We're involved in NORAD. And yet we have to put in that time and effort to keep that relationship going. And as I was writing the book and researching it, which is firmly set in the Second World War, with a chapter looking at the legacy of it, I kept seeing, you know, today, the contemporary elements. And I think sometimes that's an interesting part of being a historian. You're writing about the past. You're trying to situate it in the past. You're trying to understand the history and the stories and the characters and personalities within the past. But I live in the present. I live in the contemporary, and so one is always careful about how you write these things. Yeah.
We have a couple of minutes, and I want to make sure we talk about film. You had mentioned film, and I want to talk about the National Film Board played a key role in keeping Canadians informed on the war and keeping them and supporting them. I want to show a clip from a series, Canada at War in 1942. Let's have a look.
We gotta buy war bonds to finish the war. We gotta buy more bonds, we've done it before. Every single dollar that we lend brings us one day closer to the end. We gotta buy war bonds, it's more than a song. We gotta buy more bonds, speed victory along. Don't spend it, lend it, help to end it. Come on, buy bonds.
Has a nice little jingle to it, doesn't it?
It does.
Tell me a little bit. That was just a snippet of what was happening there. But in the few minutes that we have, why were these films and these messages important when we talk about sort of the cultural scene that was happening?
Yeah, the cultural scene and mobilizing ideas. And we think of propaganda, and I think that's pretty good propaganda, catchy tune. Of course, our cities there are war posters everywhere. The war on the home front, Canadians are encouraged to do their bit and contribute. But one of the things I looked at was the emergence of the National Film Board, of course, which we have a film industry before the war, but it's really the war that propels the NFB and the CBC forward. The CBC is reporting overseas. The NFB is taking a lot of that footage, often captured by combat cameramen, and creating films for Canadians. And so, unlike the First World War, where we get most of our news through the newspapers, the Second World War, it's almost live, right? The footage that we see there, the creation of these films, radio, it's really quite staggering. So it connects Canadians to this war and their loved ones. I mentioned the 1.1 million Canadians in uniform. There are some poignant stories that I uncovered of mothers who saw their sons on film. And it creates that connection, because otherwise they could have been gone 3, 4, 5 years. And one of the things, just to come back to the book then, is that we create these films both as sword and shield. Shield to protect us from American culture, sword to carve out our own sense of identity, especially with the Americans. And we do a really good job. And I talk about this in the book, the films that go to the U.S. to tell our story about the war. That's important because I think after the war, we go through a period of forgetting and apathy, and we don't build a separate World War II national monument. And veterans are everywhere. They reintegrate back into society. But we really didn't focus a lot on the Second World War until quite recently. And I argue that's done some damage to our own sense of self and what we have done as Canadians. And this is a prime example, I would argue, of how we stepped up and how we punched above our weight and how both the Americans and the British needed us. And frankly, the Soviet Union, we sent tens of millions of dollars of supplies to them after they become our unlikely allies in June of 1941. And all of this, I think, is a story that Canadians, I think, can be proud of. I think I'm not, again, a stand behind the flag, hand on your heart historian. There are a lot of mistakes made in war. 45,000 Canadians killed in service, 55,000 wounded. And yet, this was a time when we really step up and we cement that important alliance with the United States. And I do hope that there will be some Americans who watch this maybe want to pick up the book and have a better sense of this, because this history matters.
Tim, we're going to leave it there. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for, just wish I had you as a historian or a history teacher when I was in school. That was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Monday, November 4th, 2024. Just before we go, we'd like to express our condolences to the family of former Senator Murray Sinclair, who was a guest on this program many times and was chair of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and beyond all that, was a real mensch. May he rest in peace. Tomorrow on the program, we look at the fight to save the Revue Cinema, located in the heart of Ontario's capital city. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.